President Grimson, I need to thank him, mostly for allowing us to have this defense panel, but most importantly for putting us right after Senator Murkowski and not allowing a break. Everybody has remained here, and we have a great audience because of it, so thank you. President Grimson, distinguished guests, colleagues, my name's Matt Hickey. I'm the Associate Director at the new Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. It's the Department of Defense's newest regional center located in Anchorage, Alaska. This is a critical time for practitioners of security and defense. The world is relying on the skills intact of diplomats and defense officials alike to determine the outcome of many critical crises. And it's been said that the Arctic has been immune from the consequences of conflicts occurring elsewhere in the world. That what happens outside of the Arctic stays outside the Arctic. Yet when I landed here, it dawned on me that thinking might be a little bit flawed. The taxi driver that drove me from the airport was from Afghanistan, having fled the war there. Later that same day, during a briefing at the U.S. Embassy, I learned of the outsized contributions that this small country of Iceland here high in the North Atlantic is providing not only to NATO, but to the war in Ukraine. Examples that what occurs outside the Arctic does not impact what occurs in it. So perhaps it's more accurate to say then that conflicts that occur outside the Arctic don't also become conflicts inside the Arctic. And while that notion is true, it's hard to ignore that the recent military activity in the region. Russia has continued its militarization of the Arctic despite losses in Ukraine. And NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said there's now significant Russian military buildup in the high north, with recent tensions causing the alliance to double its presence in response. And this past August, as Senator Murkowski mentioned, Russian and Chinese naval vessels were seen operating off the coast of Alaska, prompting 4 U.S. destroyers to the area. Finland has joined NATO. Sweden will soon to follow. The U.S. Defense Department is set to release a new Arctic strategy. This is leading to many questions, which is why we have assembled this panel here today. So Louise, I want to come to you to get this started. The Arctic, as we know it, is an ocean surrounded by 8 countries, 5 of which are coastal states. There's much that we know about it, yet there's still many misconceptions about it. What are those? So we're all operating on the same understanding here.
Should I go?
Please.
Thank you. There are quite a few misconceptions, but I think from a security policy perspective, it is a bit of a concern that there is still a notion around that the Arctic is an ungoverned space, that it's up for grabs, that it's a race for resources. Compliance with international law is fundamental for peace and security everywhere in the world, even more so in the Arctic. The Arctic is not isolated from global developments, never has been. So the stability that we have enjoyed in this region over the last quarter of a century didn't just happen. It was a conscious decision by the Arctic states' governments to opt for dialogue and cooperation. And this was being done within a framework of international law that is now very well developed. And even though we have difficulties right now cooperating, it's not possible at all to have business as usual with Russia. But this framework of international law in the Arctic remains intact. And we're not going to have a legal seminar here, but I just want to point out two things. We, the Arctic states, we have territorial sovereignty over our land. I don't think anyone questions that. But in the Arctic, you also see one of the most successful implementation of UNCLOS in the world. The exclusive economic zones of the coastal states are established, and more important, they are not contested but respected. And the UNCLOS also provides for the coastal states sovereign rights to all living and non-living resources in the water pillar, in the exclusive economic zones, but more so on the continental shelf, on the seabed and the subsoil. And this is also where all the resources in the Arctic is when we're talking about oil and gas. So I just want to have that said. Thank you.
So if the law is clear, Inga, are we worried about the militarization of the region?
Well, I think part of the reason why the Arctic has gained a lot more attention lately is one thing is, of course, climate change and the very strong consequences this has in the Arctic, much more than in some other places of the world. But the other element is, of course, the increased global security tension, which is also seen in the Arctic. But as such, there's nothing new about it. Norway is a founding member of NATO back from 1949, and the reason for that is that we realized the need to be in an alliance in the very exposed strategic environment that Norway is located in. Right across the border, we have one of the largest naval bases in the world, as well as a huge accumulation of nuclear weapons, and that's been there for well over half a century. There's nothing new about that. Yeah. What is new is, of course, Russia's war against Ukraine, which also in itself demonstrates a leadership in Russia that is radicalized and more unpredictable, creating huge tensions towards all its neighbors. Norway has almost 200-kilometer land border with Russia. It's calm. We want to keep it calm. We do our best to maintain orderly relations with our neighbor. But the huge cooperation that we had developed over these last 3 decades, unfortunately, is not possible to pursue in this situation. And that is very much to the detriment of all the people living in the region. Because that's my major point, in fact. The Arctic is not some kind of far-off security theater. It's our home. It's a third of Norway's territory and a tenth of its population live in the Arctic. It's something we experience every day.
So Petteri, not long ago I had the opportunity to visit with your ambassador in Washington, and what he told me is that historically, if Washington and Moscow want to know what they're thinking of each other, they both go to Helsinki. So take us to Helsinki. What is Russia thinking right now?
I think I need to talk to my ambassador in Washington. We Finns always get this question. Allow me first to apologize that you don't have a Finnish brigadier here. His flight was cancelled. So what you have is a first lieutenant in reserve and an Arctic ambassador. Security and defense is not really my immediate area of expertise, but I went yesterday to a session which was entitled, "What do the Arctic ambassadors need to know about global risks?" And at the end of the session, the moderator concluded by saying that the Arctic ambassadors are our superheroes. So in that spirit, I try to answer the question. I wish I had the definitive answer there, but I have spent my whole career on dealing with Russia one way or the other in Moscow and Brussels and everywhere. And I'm weary of anyone, myself included, trying to offer simplistic explanations because I don't think that they exist. We sometimes have the temptation of seeing every erratic decision as part of a carefully designed master plan, and that is debatable. I mean, what we know is that unpredictability has become a policy of its own right. They want to keep us guessing what they mean, what they want, and what they will do next. And at times I wonder if Russians themselves know what Russia wants. But we need to stay informed, prepared, resilient, and prepared to counter and confront what comes. And we will. No doubt about that.
So to get the details, maybe I got to actually travel to Helsinki. That's what you're saying. So Iris, coming over to you, our Nordic colleagues here have long dealt within their government directly with the Arctic. In my time in Washington before my current role, behind the scenes there was a lot of effort to create the office that you're currently in now. You are the first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Arctic and Global Resilience. And as the Senator alluded to, it was an effort to get there. But personnel is policy. Now we have a person in that seat. Why did the United States create the office that you currently sit in now?
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt, and thanks for including this as part of the conversation in the broader fabric that is the Arctic community, and in the broader topics. It's really important that we talk about security issues. It's fundamental. It's important to drive information and also to drive understanding with one another about where we are. So I appreciate that being part of the conversation. And I think, to your question, thanks to the championship of Senator Murkowski and other Arctic advocates within Congress, because there's been a bit of a awakening within the Department of Defense on tackling issues in the Arctic region. There's also been some fairly significant geopolitical changes that have taken place in the Arctic region. Some of them all have been mentioned here already, but they're worth re-highlighting again. NATO's enlargement, of course, is a really huge one. The fact that Finland has joined and hopefully Sweden just on the doorsteps, what that means for NATO regional plans and how we exercise, show deterrence, how we look at capability development is really critical, and the DOD needs a center point in order to have those meaningful conversations. There's also increased activity by some of our competitors in the region. There has not been necessarily a slowdown of activity in the Russian Arctic, despite some of the crisis in Ukraine, and that's telling. There's an immense amount of importance that is put in the Arctic region, and so we just need to be mindful of activity that's taking place and whether or not we have the right capabilities to deter threats and also to see them. And we also see increasing alignment with our competitors, especially off the coast of Alaska. So it's worth us just being mindful of some of these dynamics, and climate change is also a huge component of what's driving much of the activity and much of the strategic interests, and it needs to be underscored as a really critical component to how we think about it within the DOD. And just a few quick seconds on the other part of my office, as I was listening to the questions that were asked to Senator Murkowski about climate change, there's probably the question is, does the DOD care about climate change? I know that's been a perennial question, but the answer is yes. The other part of my office, Global Resilience, is really targeted at looking at what does the climate crisis mean for the Department of Defense? How are we interpreting climate risk, whether it be in the Arctic or it be in Africa or it be in South America? All across the board, we're looking at climate risk and how our combatant commands are interpreting it in their theater plans, but it's also looking at the energy transition and how the DOD is set up to respond to the energy transition. We play a big role in our own emissions, and we need to be mindful of efficiencies that we can be gaining by leveraging new technology. We also need to be looking at where we can innovate and make investments in our own platforms, such as with a new blended wing body aircraft, which could be potentially 30% greater efficiency than our normal tube and wing body design. So I could go on a lot on that topic, but I just wanted the audience to know that there is a lot of really deep thinking happening within the Department of Defense on both of these issue sets, because they are at the forefront of as the geopolitical environment.
So we pushed for this office to cover the Arctic, and then suddenly they send all these other things upon you. Sounds like you're pretty busy with a number of things.
They're mutually reinforcing.
I want to come back to the climate conversation here in a second, but you mentioned NATO, and NATO, when I think of NATO, it's cooperation. It's countries cooperating. Inga, cooperation has been a stabilizing force in the Arctic. How do we maintain that? You're an expert in security policy in the high north. How do we maintain that level of cooperation when competition's on the rise?
Well, to some extent, I think cooperation has many facets. One thing is, of course, what you just mentioned, NATO. The cooperation between allies in NATO is absolutely crucial for Norway's security and for the stability in the north. And we see that picking up, not only by nation and NATO's planning, but also its operational activities, very carefully calibrated allied presence, exercise activities, etc., etc. That is a stabilizing force in itself. We also see that cooperation between the Nordic countries is picking up, which is very good also, also in the security and military fields. Operationally, it has been going on even before Finland joined NATO and Sweden started thinking about it. But it has certainly picked up a lot. But we also see it on the civilian side. Mm-hmm. And I think that is really important because, as I said, people live in the north. And making the civilian society more robust, more resilient in every respect, be it communications, energy systems, all of that is also something we need to do to make it the situation more stable. And institutionally, across the Arctic, we also want to maintain the structures where we can interact with our neighbor Russia. We do that bilaterally, even if it is now at a minimum level. We still cooperate with Russia on managing our common border. We cooperate with Russia on search and rescue at sea. We cooperate with Russia on managing our common cod stocks. But the Arctic Council is the essential body for cooperation in the Arctic on common challenges. And we want to maintain this structure, even under today's circumstances, where much of its activities are, of course, limited by today's situation.
There's a lot to be said about the Arctic Council. I know there's a lot of side conversations and breakout sessions on that.
Yes. I just wanted to mention it.
Because the Arctic Council does play a role in security, while security is not permitted to be discussed within it, and that's an important clarification. Again, if we had the time, maybe we'd come back to that. But for a second here, I want to focus on the actual geography of the European side of the Arctic, because I think this is an important thing to understand. Norway, as you informed me, has the oldest border with Russia. Finland now perhaps is the longest border with Russia of NATO countries. And Louise, you mentioned to me earlier that while we might be discussing specifically the Arctic, you can't have this conversation about the European Arctic without connecting it to the Baltic. And how for many years that connection and the cooperation amongst Nordic countries has impacted the security of that region because of what that region geographically represents to Russia, what they need it for, and why cooperation is important. Can you explain that a little bit to the audience, why that geography matters, and that helps put the militarization into context? Because the Arctic has had military presence for a long time.
As we're not in NATO yet, I'm a bit hesitant, so I'm going to ask Inga to continue a little bit. But I think when you look at the high north, our area of the Arctic, the North Cap, Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea, and the link to the North Atlantic, and the landmass and the Baltic Sea, that is a strategic whole, both for Russia and for NATO. So that is why it's a little bit difficult only to focus on discussing the militarization in the Arctic. It doesn't really make any sense. It's hard to understand it, and also from an operational, you have to see it as a whole, as a strategic whole. But this is Norway has been NATO's eyes and ears in the Arctic and the high north, for the last 50 years.
Well, I would like to add that following up on what you just said, to have Finland and Sweden as NATO members is certainly a huge advantage, because that will facilitate that necessary cooperation so much. And also to tie up Norway and our coastline, also it's a strategic area which also stretches, of course, towards the Baltic Sea, and also there Finland and Sweden's membership is a huge advantage. Mm-hmm. But what I would like to say about the challenge, the security challenge, is of course that what we can see, because of the war in Ukraine, some Russian forces in the north have been drawn down. That sounds like a great thing, but we must at the same time realize that all of its naval and air capacities are intact. The nuclear bases are intact. I mean, it's not like because something is going on in Russia's south, there's nothing going on in the north. That's not the case.
Some very important strategic capabilities remain in the Arctic.
Yes.
Right now.
Yes.
Despite what we might read, or see in the media of the depletion of forces. That is true as well, and this is an example of how they both can
it's
be.
mainly true as for army soldiers.
And before we transition to come back to you, Iris, because I want to get to the climate conversation, because we can't talk about the Arctic without talking about the security as it relates to climate. But the newest member to NATO, Petteri, there's many contributions that Finland's going to provide and have provided as a partner. Can you explain some of those to the audience now?
I think there were several points here that I would love to comment. Obviously, Arctic Council was mentioned. I'd like to get up and do my defensive speech on the Arctic Council, but I've done it before.
Save that for later.
On NATO, we would obviously wish to see Sweden acceding to NATO or joining NATO as soon as possible. From the Finnish perspective, the Arctic security is, on the one hand, part of the wider Euro-Atlantic security, but it's also connected to the Baltic Sea region security, as you alluded to. And Finland is right between these two areas, with 1,328 kilometers of common border with the Russian Federation, if I remember the number of kilometers correctly. And the thing is that we in Finland, we are prepared, we are resilient, we have a very good situational awareness and understanding of the situation. I think it's noteworthy that one of the recent polls suggested that 83% of Finns would be ready to defend Finland even if the outcome was uncertain. And 89% of the Finns trust in the capabilities of the Finnish armed forces in defending Finland. The Finnish armed forces don't even have an Arctic contingent because the armed forces in totality are compatible to Arctic circumstances. So that's something that there are different scenarios that we need to prepare ourselves for, and we're very glad to be in the alliance with our good partners with whom we have cooperated for decades. Let me, if you allow me, just finish with one point, because when I was asked yesterday to sit in this panel, and I thought of the topic, and it occurred to me that I see two risks. One risk is the militarization of the Arctic and everything that comes with that. But the second risk that I see is the militarization of our mindsets, in a sense that we lose the ability to see everything which is outside the domain of military security. And I have in mind the climate change. I have in mind the situation of our indigenous peoples, the need for sustainable development, and everything that comes in the wider Arctic cooperation structure. So while we're working on the Arctic security, we have to keep a wider perspective all the time on all things.
Petteri, thank you. Your ambassador has kindly reminded me many times that Finland's contributions to NATO are going to be phenomenal because they have fought no less than 40 wars with Russia over the years, just 40. And he happened to mention that they've defeated them in the sauna world championships too. So, Iris, I want to move geographically a little bit here to come back to some things. We're running a little bit low on time. Half your portfolio is Arctic. The other half is what in the title is global resilience. And I think you alluded to a little bit what that is. A little bit of Arctic, or excuse me, a little bit of energy, a little bit of climate. Can you give us a look inside the global resilience side of it and why the United States addressing climate and addressing energy through your office in the Department of Defense will make a difference as we address security?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really critical question, and you could talk ad nauseum about how the Arctic is seeing changes from climate change and the impact that that's having on militaries, whether it be infrastructure and permafrost thaw or coastal erosion. But there's a global implication too, and that's really what my office is charged with looking at our broad policies in the department, saying our big big mammoth strategic documents like the National Defense Strategy. The DOD is probably unlike any organization in the world, that it sings and hums by its strategic documents, and the resourcing and the budget are the Pentagon's love language in many ways. So where you find action and movement is when you see key policy words in these documents and when you see budget alignment. And that's where we're seeing in our current administration on climate topics. So for the global resilience side of the house, it's really looking at the energy transition at large. How are we positioning ourselves in a way of strategic advantage? How are we being deliberate in how we're interpreting and how we're using our strategic policy documents so that the force understands that this is a risk that we need to be thinking about? How are we driving efficiencies in a way that's meaningful for our warfighters? In many of our war games that we see that we have been conducting across every combatant command with every service, we see that there's one liability for the military. It's fuel. It's often as a target for our adversaries, but it's also where we can see a potential margin of victory if we have greater efficiencies in our platforms and how we operate. There's also an element of resilience. Are we building our infrastructure to be more resilient, not only to the changing effects of extreme weather, but how are we ensuring that we have the right energy security and resilience? We saw with the war in Ukraine, some of these same concepts being grappled with in Europe. How resilient of the supplies do we have at our bases and our infrastructure? So really focusing on microgrids and long energy duration storage capacity for some of our bases. And it's also really working with our partners in this regard. Later, in about a month or so, I'm bringing together 10 treaty allies over to California to talk about these concepts with one another. In many ways, they're unclassified, quite frankly. What are we doing from a strategic perspective? What are we doing? How are we operationalizing our strategies through war games, through analysis of platforms? Turns out that a C-17 won't have the same lift capacity with higher heat projected in just 15 years. How are we thinking about the real warfighter implications of climate change is really critical, and we should be sharing those lessons with one another. We're also going to be showing technology demonstrations too at the time. So yes, this portfolio is big, it's large, it's really an exciting one. And just on the Arctic, just to loop back to this convening, we're developing our new Arctic strategy, and I want to make it very clear that the DOD's intent is to maintain a stable region, to have it be a peaceful region, for us to certainly protect our interests, but for it to remain stable and peaceful. And the way that we do that is through working with and by and through our allies and partners. And so a huge part of that strategy is looking at how we collectively use one another's presence to be able to ensure stability, and what are the capabilities that we need to be able to operate should we need to, largely around domain awareness and operating capabilities there.
Historically, the Arctic Circle Assembly here has been a place where, especially the United States, has made announcements such as the National Strategy for the Arctic Region last year. The implementation plan for that strategy came out this year, so I'm glad that you've had the opportunity to inform people that the Department of Defense, not today, is releasing a strategy, but will release a strategy. Any idea when that might come out?
Yeah, likely early 2024 timeframe, and we're consulting closely with our Arctic allies as we develop the strategy. It's really critical that we have alignment with them. It's also really critical that we align with our combatant commands and the requirements that they're creating. So it's a large coordination process in the DOD, but early 2024 is the target.
So maybe next year we'll be back to talk about how
that'd be great.
What's in it and how it's going.
Yeah.
With the time that we have left, I want to play a little bit on the climate side. When I think of climate, I think of research. When I think of research in this context, I think of Arctic research. And when I think of Arctic research, I think of the role of non-Arctic countries in the Arctic. I don't think we can ignore that conversation. And so with the time we have left, I'm curious what these distinguished diplomats and defense officials would have to say, based on your experience in various forums, whether that's the Arctic Council, inside the Pentagon, various forums, what message there would be to the plethora of countries and organizations out there that want to have a role in the future of the Arctic as non-Arctic countries. Inga, please.
Well, the Arctic is part of the world. The Arctic challenges that the Arctic is facing in terms of climate originate for the most part from outside the Arctic, even though states in the Arctic, of course, have their own contributions to the challenge of climate change and need to do their own homework. This is, part of the reason why it's so important that we cooperate also outside the Arctic framework as such. And the Arctic Council has made its contributions to the global frameworks for handling climate change, for example. In the Arctic Council itself, observer countries and others are very welcome to make their contributions to the working groups and different projects that the Council carries out in this field, and that's very welcome.
Iris, I'm curious what the impression of that might be from Washington inside the Pentagon. Can you give us an insight of any of that thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the Arctic is multifaceted, but there are only 8 countries that are Arctic territory, and I think it's really important to state that the sovereign interests kind of govern much of Arctic interests, certainly from the United States perspective. And I think we're, welcome ideas, knowing that it's a part of the globe, but we're also cognizant of wanting to maintain the governance mechanisms that have long helped keep stability in the region, and we want to champion the governance mechanisms that exist for that, and that we're weary of potential internationalization of the Arctic, when really it's more about keeping sovereign interests protected.
Louise?
Yes, this is a little bit what I started with. The stability in the Arctic will depend on that the Arctic states, but also non-Arctic actors respect the legal framework that's in place, and also the forms for cooperation that we already have. So
It seems that there's maybe not international consensus or agreement, but maybe there is on that, follow the rules, you can play by the game. What if you don't play by the rules?
Well, I think that there's no running away from geography. As I mentioned, we have a nearly 200 kilometers land border with Russia. My own son served his compulsory military service as a border guard, and that's by no means a unique experience. Many Norwegian young men do that every year. On the other hand, Norwegian Arctic policy remains the same, even in today's very climate of tension, to put it that way. Strengthening international law, respect for international law, being predictable, being firm, being visible, being clear, all that has been guidelines for our policy in the North for decades, and it still is today, perhaps more important than ever. So behavior results in consequences, depending on what it is. It might be anything from breaking regulations for fisheries to military tension. And I mean, as Louise started us saying, these are states in the North. It's the legal situation in the North is clear, and sovereignty of the territories in the North is also clear. So everything else follows from that.
The legal situation is clear, the sovereignty situation is clear. Petteri?
Can I just try and answer your question on what message I would want to give to the actors outside the region? My message would be respect the role of the Arctic states and the Arctic indigenous peoples. The Arctic is our home. And with that, we're fully prepared for constructive cooperation and contributions. Cooperation is certainly needed, but you have to respect the Arctic states and the Arctic indigenous peoples. That has to be the starting point. The Arctic Council provides good opportunities for interaction, cooperation with the observers. There are 38 of them. Several others have already applied. The U-Arctic network is another wonderful framework for cooperation. So there are avenues for constructive cooperation, but please bear in mind to respect the Arctic states and Arctic indigenous peoples in your actions.
We started this panel with some remarks emphasizing the critical role that diplomats and defense officials play, especially right now, with all that's transpiring around the world, and the work that you have done to maintain an order of peace and security within the Arctic region is commendable. And I think I might speak on behalf of the audience here that we're all counting on you. And so with that said, and with the screen telling me that I'm 2 minutes over time, I just want to say thank you. Let's give them a round of applause.